Hey, what's going on, everybody? Or should I say, ni hao? This is Garrett, and I'm going to be giving you guys an introduction on some business endeavors in China, and we're going to give you some strategies to implement for your next trip to Beijing. One thing to keep in mind is that Beijing is actually 14 hours ahead of us. So putting this into practice, if we're conducting business meetings at 8 o'clock in the morning in Dallas, it's going to be 10 p.m. in China. And furthermore, if we're conducting an 8 o'clock business meeting in China in the morning, it's going to be 6 p.m. the day before in Dallas. So it's mindful to keep that on the back of your mind anytime you're needing to contact some colleagues, associates, and get some last minute information or requests. It's mindful to be wary of the time difference. Another thing to keep in mind is that there's going to be a currency exchange, which has become obviously the norm. And right now it's about 695 yuan for 100 US dollars. And the good news is your purchasing power, is actually about the same. It's and in some cases it's better. We'll take a look at that here in a second, and we will find some ways to compare that. Whenever we arrive in Beijing, we'll be arriving by plane, so obviously they have the air transportation down. Other popular forms, obviously cars, but the railways are used exclusively. There's subways, and there's also taxi cabs. So whenever we arrive in Beijing, we really won't have a problem getting around. It should be relatively easy to get to our destination. Now, touching back on purchasing power, I just did a quick Google search, and I found that taxi fare rates inside Beijing around the airport is roughly $1 a mile. Now, obviously, it was in kilometers, but I did the conversions, and it comes out for a 5-mile trip. It costs you about $5. And this is great news because I don't know if any of you have taken a cab from Dallas-Fort Worth or from the George Bush International Airport, but it is very expensive. You're definitely going to be spending about 30 to 50 bucks for that same 5-mile trip. So this is good. And also, in comparison for purchasing power, I did another Google search. I looked at some hotel options around the airport there in Beijing, and it looked like you can get a hotel anywhere from $50 to about $125. And in comparison, if you were to arrive at Dallas-Fort Worth, you would be looking at spending anywhere from $110 to $200 on up for a hotel. So this is also good news. Whenever we get to Beijing, another thing to keep in mind is that there's going to be a different language spoken there. And China in particular is a little bit difficult because there are over 200 dialects in Chinese. But the most popular one is Mandarin, and another popular one is Cantonese. And in Beijing, you're typically going to find people that are speaking Mandarin. And so it's good that if you're going to be picking up any kind of dictionary or any kind of translation device that you are practicing your Mandarin. But it's also important to keep in mind that even though the main language that's spoken there is Mandarin, China has over 1.3 billion people, and roughly 20% of them speak English. So if you do the math, that's an easy estimate between 250 to 300 million people, which is about the same amount as the United States. So it's a good chance that you're going to find somebody that speaks English there, and you should have no problem, communicating with locals or with anybody within service that can get you where you need to go or get you what you need for your help. Let's see what else. So let's see. Documents. You're going to need some documentation specifically for China that is a little bit different than other places. You are going to need a passport, which is the normal. And, as we all know, passports are good for 10 years. However, within China, specifically Beijing, you're going to need a passport that has an expiration date that is, no less than 6 months after your planned date of stay. So let's just say you're going to arrive in June, you'll be leaving in July. Your passport is going to have to be valid for an extra 6 months. So it's going to have to be at least good until January. I'm assuming the country has these standards put in place, and that's just a safeguard in case anything happens. If your stay has to be extended, at least you're in there legally. But another thing to keep in mind, and probably most importantly, is that whenever you plan on visiting Beijing, you are going to need at least 2 blank pages in your passport specifically reserved for your visa and your entry stamps in and out of China. Now, if you go to Hong Kong, this is not the case. You don't need a visa, but you're still going to be required of a passport. So we've looked at some documentation, we've looked at some language barriers, we've looked at, some currency exchange rates and a little bit of the time difference. Now it's going to be good to go ahead and brush up on some cultural differences. Obviously, we understand that cultural differences are not only a large part of communication mishaps, but just business mishaps in general. So it's good to keep your cultural differences in mind and find ways to combat those. One thing to know is that handshakes are actually becoming increasingly popular in China. So it's okay to go ahead and shake your associate's hand, or whenever you meet someone to shake their hand. But it's also good to be aware and to know that they may typically just give you a bow or a nod, and both are going to be acceptable. And furthermore, the customs and courtesies for greetings are that elders begin the greeting. So look for the eldest or the most senior position to begin the greeting, and whenever you reciprocate, you always reciprocate in the same fashion. The eldest or the most senior position receives the greeting first, and then you move on throughout the room. Another thing is business cards. Here in the States, I don't know about you guys, but I've given my business cards out in a relatively nonchalant manner, a very informal, and in Japan, or excuse me, in Beijing, it is absolutely not the case. In China, it is customary to hold the business card with both hands when presenting and receiving. And more importantly, whenever you are presenting your business card, the text needs to be facing the individual that you're presenting it to. China is very, very instilled within tradition and hierarchy and respect. And so it's good to observe these norms whenever you're doing any kind of practices, especially business practices, if you want to be taken seriously. Lastly, one thing about China is that they find red to be a color of good luck. So I wore my red shirt today, and hopefully it's going to be some good luck for this presentation for you guys. And so now that we've gone through some basics when dealing with China, specifically Beijing, some things to remember are that they are 14 hours ahead of us. So keep that in mind whenever you're making your phone calls back and forth. The cost of living, or excuse me, the purchasing power and exchange rate, you're going to be doing just fine. You shouldn't have any problems. And lastly, wear your favorite red shirt or pack a good red tie. It'll bring you good luck. Bye, guys.